The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. According to the HOA, the main entrance road to their neighborhood now belonged to them. Not me. Them. At first I thought it was a mistake. A clerical error. Maybe somebody mixed up parcel numbers. But then the second letter arrived. This one came from an attorney. The wording was different. The message wasn't transfer ownership. Sign the documents. Stop interfering with HOA property. I sat there staring at the page. Because the entrance they were claiming wasn't HOA property. It wasn't county property. It wasn't public property. It was part of my ranch. And it always had been. The road crossed land my family had owned for decades. Long before the subdivision existed. Long before the HOA board members ever moved there. Long before a single house was built. I figured proving that would take 5 minutes. Pull the deed. Show the survey. End of story. I was wrong. Because the HOA wasn't confused. They genuinely believed the entrance belonged to them. And the deeper I dug, the stranger things became. Old county records didn't match newer filings. Property maps showed lines that made no sense. Some documents seemed to contradict others. Then I found something hidden inside a stack of development paperwork. Something nobody on the HOA board appeared to know. Something the developer had buried years earlier. That's when I realized this wasn't really about the entrance. The entrance was only the beginning. Because according to the original records, a large section of their neighborhood had been built on land connected to my property rights. Land nobody had questioned for years. Land worth millions. And the people threatening me with legal action had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Neither did I. Not yet. The first phone call came 3 days after the HOA delivered that letter. It was from a homeowner I had never met. His voice sounded nervous. Almost rushed. He asked one question. Is any of this actually true? I knew exactly what he meant. News travels fast inside HOA communities. Especially when property rights get involved. I told him I wasn't sure what version of the story he had heard. There was a long pause. Then he said something interesting. The board told us you were trying to block access to the neighborhood. That caught my attention. Because I had never threatened anything. I hadn't closed a gate. I hadn't changed a lock. I hadn't even responded to the HOA's demand yet. Yet somehow, residents were already being told I was the problem. The call ended politely. But it left me thinking. Someone was working very hard to control the narrative. A week later another homeowner called. Then another. Then another. Most of them were respectful. Some sounded worried. A few sounded angry. Not at me. At the board. Because details were starting to leak. People had learned attorneys were involved. People had learned surveys were being reviewed. And people had learned the county records office had received multiple document requests. Whenever that happens in a neighborhood dispute, everyone assumes something bigger is hiding underneath. Most of the time they're right. At that point my attorney was still reviewing the property history. The ranch had belonged to my family for decades. Long before the subdivision existed. Long before the HOA existed. Long before anyone imagined hundreds of homes would sit behind that entrance road. My grandfather bought the land in the late 1960s. Back then it was mostly cattle pasture. Open fields. Creeks. Wooded areas. Nothing fancy. Just working land. Over the years portions were sold off. Small sections. Carefully planned. But my grandfather had always been particular about one thing. Access. He never liked giving away road rights. He believed roads created problems. And problems lasted forever. At the time I thought that was just old rancher thinking. Now I wasn't so sure. The attorney called me one Friday afternoon. His tone was different. Serious. Measured. The kind of voice lawyers use when they find something important. He told me he had located several original agreements connected to the development. Some dated back more than 20 years. Some had signatures from developers, county officials, surveyors, land planners. The documents weren't easy to interpret. But one thing stood out. The HOA's claim of ownership looked weak. Very weak. That should have been good news. Instead, it created a new problem. Because if the HOA didn't own the entrance, who did? The answer wasn't completely clear. Not yet. The following Monday, I drove to the county offices. I wanted to see some of the records myself. The building wasn't impressive. Just an older government office filled with filing cabinets and archived maps. The clerk brought out several survey books. Large rolled documents. Yellowed pages. Old plats. Easements. Dedications. Property transfers. Hours passed. Then I noticed something. A boundary line. At first it seemed insignificant. Just another mark on another survey. But it didn't match newer records. Not exactly. I checked again. Then again. The difference was small. But it mattered. A lot. Because that boundary appeared to place part of the subdivision entrance inside land still connected to my ranch parcel. I sat there staring at the map, trying to figure out if I was missing something. Maybe an amendment. Maybe a correction. Maybe a later transfer. But I couldn't find one. The next morning I sent copies to my attorney. A few hours later he called. He sounded surprised. Which was unusual. Attorneys don't like sounding surprised. That's the same issue we're seeing. Those were his exact words. Issue. Not mistake. Not error. Issue. Meaning nobody was certain what had happened. Only that something didn't line up. And when property records don't line up, things can get expensive fast. Word somehow reached the HOA board. I still don't know how. Maybe a county employee talked. Maybe someone overheard conversations. Maybe one of the homeowners had connections. Whatever happened, the board suddenly became much more aggressive. Letters started arriving. Formal notices. Demands. Requests for documentation. Requests for meetings. Requests for immediate clarification. It felt less like confidence. More like panic. One board member even drove out to the ranch. He stayed near the entrance. Taking photos. Measuring things. Writing notes. A ranch employee spotted him. The employee asked what he was doing. The board member left immediately. No explanation. Just drove away. That evening my phone rang again. This time it was a homeowner who lived near the front of the subdivision. His house overlooked part of the entrance road. He sounded frustrated. Apparently the HOA had called a special meeting. Attendance was unusually high. People wanted answers. Instead they got warnings. Warnings about legal disputes. Warnings about property interference. Warnings about possible access issues. The homeowner said something that stuck with me. They looked scared. Not angry. Not confident. Scared. That wasn't normal. HOA boards usually project authority. Even when they're wrong. Fear suggested something else. Maybe they had seen the same records. Maybe their attorney had seen them. Maybe someone finally realized the situation wasn't unfolding the way they expected. Then came the mini twist nobody saw coming. A former developer contacted my attorney. Not the original developer. One of the later partners involved during expansion phases. He was retired. Long gone from the project. But he remembered parts of the deal. According to him, the entrance road had been a source of disagreement from the beginning. Years before the first house was built. Years before the first homeowner moved in. Apparently negotiations over access had dragged on for months. Maybe longer. Unfortunately, his memory wasn't perfect. He couldn't remember specific language. He couldn't remember final signatures. But he remembered arguments. A lot of arguments. In one sentence. A sentence he claimed he heard repeatedly. Don't assume the road comes with the land. That sentence hit hard. Because suddenly old concerns started making sense. The retired developer agreed to search through old records stored in boxes at his property. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe everything had already been archived elsewhere. But if he found something, it could answer a lot of questions. A week passed. Then another. Tension kept building. Residents were talking. Rumors spread. Some claimed the HOA could lose the entrance. Others claimed the ranch could sue the neighborhood. Neither story was accurate. But once rumors start, facts become secondary. One afternoon I arrived at the ranch and found something unexpected. Fresh survey flags. Bright orange. Placed near sections of the entrance corridor. I hadn't ordered them. My attorney hadn't ordered them. The county hadn't ordered them. At least not officially. Someone had surveyed something. Or tried to. The flag stretched farther than I expected. Past the decorative stone sign. Past the landscaped island. Past several utility areas. I followed them carefully. The path they created led toward a section of ground almost nobody paid attention to. A narrow strip. Easy to overlook. Easy to dismiss. Until you checked old maps. My attorney arrived the next morning. Together we walked the area. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. The flags were pointing toward the exact location where several conflicting records overlapped. The exact location creating all the confusion. The exact location that might determine who actually controlled access. Then my attorney stopped walking. He looked down. Then he looked at me. And for the first time since this started, he seemed genuinely concerned. Because partially buried beneath years of dirt and grass, we had just found an old survey marker. And according to the number stamped into that metal marker, the entire dispute might be much bigger than anyone realized. The marker wasn't supposed to be there. At least not according to the newer surveys. That was the first problem. The second problem was much worse. The number stamped into the metal cap matched a survey reference from nearly 25 years earlier. A survey everyone thought had been replaced. My attorney crouched beside it. Brushed away more dirt. Checked the markings again. Then checked them a third time. Neither of us spoke. Because if that marker was original, several assumptions about the subdivision could be wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The next few days became a blur of phone calls. Surveyors. Attorneys. County record staff. Title companies. Everyone seemed to be searching for the same answer. What happened during the original development? The deeper we looked, the stranger things became. One file referenced a roadway easement. Another referenced access rights. A third referenced maintenance obligations. But none of them seemed to fit together perfectly. Pieces existed. The puzzle did not. Meanwhile, the HOA board became increasingly defensive. A homeowner forwarded me part of a community email. The board insisted everything was under control. They insisted ownership was clear. They insisted rumors were inaccurate. The problem was, nobody writes messages like that unless people are already worried. And people were worried. Very worried. A special board meeting filled every available seat. Homeowners packed the clubhouse. Some stood against the walls. Others waited outside. Several demanded answers. One resident reportedly asked a simple question. If everything is clear, why are lawyers involved? Nobody answered directly. The room grew quiet. That silence spread quickly through the neighborhood. By the following weekend, almost everyone seemed to know something was wrong. Not what. Just that something wasn't right. Then another unexpected detail surfaced. The retired developer called. He had found old boxes. Lots of them. Contracts. Correspondence. Handwritten notes. Survey drafts. Meeting records. Most weren't useful. But one document caught his attention. It wasn't signed. It wasn't finalized. But it referenced negotiations involving the entrance corridor. Specifically the entrance corridor. He emailed copies to my attorney. Within an hour my attorney called. His voice sounded different again. Careful. Very careful. The document wasn't proof of anything. Not legally. But it revealed something interesting. The original developers appeared to have known there were unresolved concerns regarding portions of the entrance property. Concerns serious enough to generate multiple revisions. That changed the tone of the entire dispute. Because now we weren't talking about a random mapping discrepancy. We were talking about an issue people may have known existed years earlier. The retired developer remembered something else too. A meeting. A heated one. Several land planners. Several attorneys. Multiple developers. According to him, discussions became tense when access rights were mentioned. He couldn't remember the exact outcome. But he remembered people arguing over deadlines. Money. Approvals. Construction schedules. The kind of pressure that causes mistakes. Or shortcuts. Neither possibility was comforting. A few days later, the HOA's attorney requested a meeting. That surprised everyone. Up until then, the board had acted aggressively. Now they suddenly wanted discussions. My attorney agreed. The meeting happened in a conference room near the county courthouse. Nothing dramatic. Just lawyers. Documents. Maps. Survey records. Hours passed. Neither side revealed everything. That's how these meetings work. But one thing became obvious. The HOA's legal team was no longer acting confident. They asked questions. Lots of questions. Questions about boundaries. Questions about easements. Questions about historical ownership. Questions that suggested uncertainty. When the meeting ended, my attorney looked thoughtful. Not victorious. Thoughtful. Which usually meant the situation remained complicated. Outside the building, he gave me a simple summary. They're trying to figure out what they actually have. That wasn't reassuring. Because if the HOA's own attorneys were still trying to determine their position, the situation was probably messier than anyone imagined. Then came the first visible sign of panic. A contractor appeared at the entrance. Without notice. Without explanation. The crew began inspecting landscaping. Signs. Lighting systems. Decorative walls. At first nobody paid attention. Then homeowners started asking questions. Why was the HOA suddenly documenting every structure near the entrance? Nobody knew. Some suspected insurance concerns. Others suspected legal concerns. The rumors multiplied. One homeowner posted photos in a community discussion group. Within hours, arguments exploded. Residents accused the board of hiding information. Board supporters accused residents of spreading fear. The neighborhood divided into camps. And the pressure kept growing. Then a man named Eric contacted me. I had never met him before. He had lived near the entrance for nearly a decade. He sounded frustrated. Mostly because he felt nobody was telling homeowners the full story. Eric had attended multiple meetings. According to him, board members appeared increasingly nervous whenever access rights were discussed. One board member reportedly became irritated during a question session. Another refused to comment entirely. Eric said something else. Something that immediately caught my attention. A survey crew had visited the entrance several months before the dispute started. Months before. Not weeks. Months. That mattered. Because it suggested the board may have been investigating something long before they sent me that demand letter. Maybe they discovered a problem. Maybe they suspected a problem. Either way, the timing felt important. My attorney began looking into it. Eventually we confirmed survey activity had occurred. What we couldn't determine was why. The records weren't public. The instructions weren't available. The purpose remained unclear. That uncertainty became its own source of tension. Because nobody likes discovering pieces of a story after the fact. Especially when property rights are involved. Then the county entered the picture. Not through enforcement. Not through litigation. Through questions. Several departments began requesting clarifications regarding historical plats and recorded documents. That rarely happens without a reason. The requests weren't directed at me. They weren't directed at homeowners. They were administrative. Technical. Routine on paper. Yet everyone understood the implication. Government staff were reviewing records too. And that made people uneasy. One afternoon, I drove past the entrance and noticed several residents standing near the monument sign. Talking. Pointing. Looking toward the ranch. The moment they saw my truck, the conversation stopped. A few nodded politely. Others looked concerned. One man approached. He introduced himself, then asked the question almost everyone seemed to be asking. What happens if the records are wrong? I told him the truth. I didn't know. Because I genuinely didn't. Neither did most of the attorneys. Neither did the HOA. Neither did the county. At least not yet. The uncertainty was becoming the real problem. Not ownership. Not access. Uncertainty. And uncertainty tends to create fear. The following week produced another twist. A title researcher uncovered an overlooked filing. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It had simply been ignored for years. The filing referenced a small parcel connected to the entrance area. A parcel few people paid attention to. A parcel that appeared insignificant. Until someone looked closer. The dimensions didn't match modern assumptions. Neither did the ownership references. My attorney immediately ordered additional review. So did the HOA. Now both sides were examining the same forgotten parcel. Both sides were trying to understand why it existed. And both sides seemed increasingly concerned about the answer. Then came the call that changed everything. It arrived late in the afternoon. The retired developer again. This time he sounded unsettled. More unsettled than before. He had found another box. One stored separately from the others. Inside were older project records. Original planning materials. Pre-construction documents. Early survey discussions. In one particular map. A map he believed nobody had reviewed in years. Maybe decades. He wasn't certain. But he was certain about one thing. The map showed something different from every modern version. Different enough that he refused to discuss details over the phone. He wanted my attorney to see it first. The next morning the map was delivered. Several people reviewed it. My attorney. A survey consultant. A title specialist. Nobody called me immediately. That worried me. When professionals find nothing important, they usually call quickly. When they stay silent, it means they're checking their work. Again and again. By late afternoon my attorney finally called. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked me one question. Do you remember the old cattle access road your grandfather used before the subdivision existed? I did. Barely. Most of it disappeared years ago. Or so I thought. My attorney took a long breath. Then he told me that road might be the key to everything. And according to the newly discovered map, it wasn't located where anyone believed it was. The old cattle road had almost disappeared. Years of construction had erased most traces of it. Grass grew where trucks once passed. Landscaping covered portions of it. Parts had been incorporated into the subdivision itself. Most people living there had no idea it ever existed. I barely remembered it myself. But my grandfather used it constantly. It connected different sections of the ranch. Before developers arrived. Before permits. Before streets. Before hundreds of homes appeared. The newly discovered map suggested something important. The original route didn't match the assumptions used in later documents. Not even close. That alone wasn't enough to determine ownership. But it created questions. A lot of questions. Questions nobody wanted to answer. Within days another survey team appeared. This one was different. More experienced. More thorough. They spent hours measuring. Photographing. Reviewing markers. Comparing coordinates. Every move seemed deliberate. Word spread quickly. Residents watched from driveways. From sidewalks. From golf carts. The surveyors barely spoke. That silence only fueled speculation. One homeowner approached them. The crew politely declined comment. Another homeowner tried. Same response. No answers. Just measurements. And more measurements. By then the atmosphere inside the neighborhood had changed. People were no longer treating the dispute like HOA drama. Now they viewed it as something bigger. Something that could affect every property owner behind that entrance. A community meeting was scheduled. Attendance shattered previous records. According to several residents, people arrived early just to secure seats. The board looked tense. Very tense. One homeowner later described the room as uncomfortable. Not hostile. Uncomfortable. The difference mattered. Hostility comes from anger. Discomfort comes from uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. Questions kept coming. What was happening? Who owned what? Why were surveyors back? Why were attorneys still involved? The answers remained vague. Residents noticed. Some became frustrated. Others became suspicious. One board member reportedly asked homeowners to avoid spreading rumors. That request had the opposite effect. Rumors exploded. Every conversation generated a new theory. Every theory generated another. Then came another development. A title company representative contacted my attorney. Not because of the dispute itself. Because of a problem discovered during review. One historical document referenced an access reservation. Another referenced a separate reservation. The descriptions appeared similar, but not identical. That distinction mattered. Very much. Because legal descriptions live and die by details. One misplaced line can change everything. The representative couldn't determine which version had priority. Neither could several other professionals reviewing the matter. The deeper everyone dug, the murkier things became. Then a homeowner named Mark reached out. He had lived in the subdivision since construction began. One of the earliest residents. He remembered things newer owners didn't. Construction traffic. Temporary roads. Development phases. Changing property lines. According to Mark, the entrance had been modified more than once. That caught my attention immediately. Because everyone assumed the entrance always sat where it sits today. Mark wasn't so sure. He remembered construction crews shifting portions of the roadway. Not dramatically. Just enough to improve traffic flow. At the time nobody cared. Now everyone cared. Because if roadway locations changed during development, some assumptions about historical boundaries could be wrong. Again, the survey teams started requesting older engineering records. More files surfaced. More questions followed. Then something happened nobody expected. The HOA's attorney requested another meeting. This one felt different. More urgent. More serious. The meeting lasted nearly an entire day. Maps covered tables. Documents filled folders. Survey diagrams sat everywhere. When it ended, neither side released details. That silence became news itself. Residents noticed immediately. If progress had been made, why say nothing? If nothing had changed, why meet for so long? Nobody knew. The uncertainty deepened. A week later, a county mapping specialist became involved. Not because of litigation. Because conflicting records required clarification. The specialist reviewed decades of filings. Historical plats. Parcel revisions. Road alignments. Utility easements. The workload was enormous. Several people expected quick answers. They didn't get them. Instead, the review uncovered more inconsistencies. Small ones. Technical ones. But enough to keep everyone nervous. Then came the mini twist. The HOA board suddenly stopped discussing ownership publicly. Completely. For months they had focused on ownership. Control. Authority. Now those words vanished from communications. Residents noticed immediately. The shift felt strange. Almost strategic. A homeowner forwarded me one of the latest community updates. I read it twice. Then a third time. One thing stood out. The board no longer talked about taking control of the entrance. Now they emphasized preserving access. That was a major change. A very major change. Because preserving access and claiming ownership are two completely different goals. My attorney noticed the same thing. Neither of us commented publicly. But privately we understood. Something had changed behind the scenes. Perhaps their legal review. Perhaps new records. Perhaps both. Whatever happened, the board's priorities appeared to be shifting. Fast. Then another unexpected witness surfaced. A retired county employee. He had worked in land records decades earlier. Long retired. Long removed from local politics. He contacted one of the attorneys involved. Not because he knew the answer. Because he remembered discussions. Old discussions. Discussions surrounding the subdivision approval process. His memory wasn't perfect. But one detail remained clear. Access concerns had delayed portions of the project. Not for weeks. For months. That immediately got attention. Nobody had mentioned delays before. Nobody. The retired employee remembered developers making repeated revisions. Repeated submissions. Repeated corrections. Apparently access documentation became a recurring issue. Again and again. The man couldn't provide final conclusions. But his recollections supported a troubling possibility. People knew there were complications. Long before homeowners moved in. Long before the HOA existed. Long before this dispute started. The question became obvious. If concerns existed, how were they resolved? Or were they ever fully resolved at all? No one seemed certain. Then survey results finally started returning. Not all of them. Just preliminary findings. The professionals reviewing them became noticeably cautious. Every statement carried disclaimers. Every conclusion came with qualifications. That wasn't reassuring. Professionals become cautious when stakes are high. And stakes were becoming very high. Property rights. Access rights. Maintenance responsibilities. Potential liability. Every category mattered. Every category carried consequences. Then homeowners began receiving notices about another emergency meeting. That word again. Emergency. By now residents had grown tired of emergencies. Yet attendance remained enormous. People wanted answers. They wanted certainty. Most importantly, they wanted reassurance. The board struggled to provide it. Witnesses described visible tension. Long pauses. Careful wording. Repeated consultations with attorneys. One homeowner stood up. Asked a direct question. The room reportedly became silent. The question was simple. If the entrance isn't where everyone thought it was, what does that mean for us? No immediate answer came. Not from the board. Not from council. Not from anyone. That silence lasted only seconds. But according to several attendees, it felt much longer. Outside the meeting, people gathered in groups. Talking. Guessing. Speculating. Nobody seemed relaxed anymore. The issue had grown beyond a disagreement between a ranch owner and an HOA. Now the entire neighborhood felt exposed. Then my attorney received something unexpected. A packet. Anonymous. No return address. No explanation. Inside were copies of older planning sketches. Not official records. Working drafts. The kind used during development discussions. Most were unremarkable. Except one. One sketch showed a boundary configuration unlike anything seen in current documents. At first everyone assumed it was irrelevant. Then a survey consultant noticed something. A notation. Small. Easy to overlook. Yet potentially important. Very important. The notation referenced a future adjustment that may never have occurred. Or may have occurred differently than intended. Nobody knew. Not yet. The consultant requested further verification. More records. More archives. More digging. Days later he called. His voice carried a level of concern I hadn't heard before. Not excitement. Concern. Because the notation appeared connected to the exact area surrounding the subdivision entrance. The exact area creating all the problems. The exact area both sides had spent months investigating. And if the notation meant what he suspected, the dispute wasn't centered on a single roadway. It involved a much larger portion of land. Land extending beyond the entrance itself. Land touching multiple areas of the neighborhood. That possibility changed everything. Late that evening my attorney called. I could tell immediately something significant had happened. He sounded exhausted. Focused. Careful. For several seconds he reviewed what had been confirmed. Then he stopped. Took a breath. And told me county officials had scheduled a formal review session involving multiple departments. Survey personnel. Mapping specialists. Records staff. Legal representatives. Everyone. Because after months of investigation, they finally believed they were close to understanding what happened decades ago. But there was one problem. The answer they were finding wasn't matching what the HOA believed. And according to preliminary findings, the neighborhood board was about to receive information that could completely change its position overnight. The county review session happened 2 weeks later. By then the entire neighborhood was on edge. Residents were talking about little else. Every rumor spread within hours. Every meeting attracted attention. Every document request became neighborhood news. The review itself wasn't public. But enough people were involved that information started leaking afterward. Not official information. Just reactions. And the reactions told their own story. One survey professional reportedly left looking stunned. A title specialist spent nearly an hour making phone calls in the parking lot. Even some county employees appeared surprised. That got everyone's attention. Because these people dealt with property disputes every day. Very little surprised them. Later that afternoon my attorney called. For the first time since this began. He sounded confident. Not cautious. Not uncertain. Confident. The review had finally answered the question everyone had been chasing. The records weren't missing. The records weren't contradictory. The problem was that several critical documents had been interpreted incorrectly for years. Not intentionally. Just incorrectly. One assumption had been repeated. Then repeated again. Then repeated again. Until eventually everyone accepted it as fact. Developers. Consultants. Board members. Property managers. Even some professionals reviewing later transactions. Nobody bothered to challenge it. Because nobody had a reason to. Until now. The old cattle road turned out to be the missing piece. Not because it still existed. Because it established historical access locations. Locations that appeared in older records. Locations that connected directly to boundary descriptions. Descriptions that survived long after the road disappeared. Once surveyors overlaid everything together, the picture became clear. Painfully clear. The entrance corridor had never transferred the way people believed. Parts of it had. Parts of it hadn't. And those details mattered. A lot. My attorney spent hours explaining the findings. The conclusion was surprisingly simple. The HOA did not own the entrance road. It never had. At least not the portions it claimed ownership over. The board's demand letter had been based on assumptions. Not actual ownership. But that wasn't the biggest revelation. Not even close. The real issue involved maintenance. For years the HOA had maintained landscaping. Lighting. Decorative structures. Signs. Walls. Improvements placed on land they didn't actually own. That created an entirely new set of legal questions. Questions nobody wanted. Especially the board. Because now residents wanted answers. Who approved those projects? Who reviewed the boundaries? Who authorized spending? How much money had been invested? The pressure became immediate. A special community meeting was scheduled. Attendance exceeded every previous meeting. People packed the room. Others stood outside. Some watched through windows. The board looked exhausted. Months of stress had taken a toll. Their attorney spoke first. Then survey consultants. Then property experts. The presentation lasted nearly 2 hours. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The information spoke for itself. When the final maps appeared on the screen, the room reportedly became silent. Completely silent. One homeowner later described the atmosphere as disbelief. Not anger. Disbelief. People were staring at boundaries they had assumed were settled decades earlier. Boundaries that suddenly looked very different. Then came the emotional reactions. One resident stood up immediately. Demanded explanations. Another asked why homeowners were learning this only now. Several others questioned board decisions made over the years. The frustration was obvious. Not because people feared losing their homes. That was never on the table. They were frustrated because nobody liked discovering important facts after the fact. Especially when those facts involved property. The board tried explaining. To be fair, most current members weren't responsible for the original situation. Many had joined years later. Long after the development was completed. Long after the assumptions became accepted. But homeowners were still upset. Understandably so. Then came another twist. One that surprised nearly everyone. The HOA's attorney publicly acknowledged that the board's ownership claim had no support. Just like that. Months of arguments disappeared. Months of posturing vanished. The demand letter was effectively dead. The board formally withdrew its position. That should have ended the story. Instead, it opened a new chapter. Because now everyone had to decide what happened next. The entrance remained critical. Residents still needed access. Emergency vehicles still needed access. Utility providers still needed access. Nothing about daily life changed. But legal relationships needed clarification. The HOA could no longer operate on assumptions. Neither could the ranch. Over the following months, negotiations replaced conflict. For the first time since this started, people actually talked. Productively. Surveyors finalized boundaries. Attorneys drafted agreements. County records were updated. Old confusion slowly disappeared. The process wasn't exciting. But it was necessary. One homeowner told me something interesting during that period. He said the dispute changed the neighborhood. Not physically. Mentally. People stopped assuming official claims were automatically correct. People started asking questions. Reading documents. Attending meetings. Paying attention. That alone probably prevented future problems. The most surprising reaction came from several board members themselves. Privately, they admitted they had trusted older records without verifying them. The assumption seemed reasonable at the time. Nobody expected decades-old interpretations to unravel. Yet that's exactly what happened. The retired developer eventually met with me. We talked for nearly an hour. Mostly about history. The ranch. The development. The old days. At one point he shook his head. Then laughed quietly. Not because the situation was funny. Because it was avoidable. He told me something I never forgot. The paperwork was always more important than the dirt. At first that sounded strange. Then it made perfect sense. People see roads. Signs. Gates. Landscaping. They assume physical reality tells the story. But property disputes rarely work that way. The paperwork tells the story. The land simply follows it. Several months later, the final agreements were recorded. Access rights were clarified. Maintenance responsibilities were clarified. Future obligations were clarified. Everyone finally had certainty. The county closed its review. Survey work concluded. The attorneys moved on. The neighborhood settled down. Life returned to normal. Eventually, the entrance looked exactly the same as before. Same road. Same sign. Same landscaping. Most visitors would never know anything happened. But the people who lived there knew. And the board definitely knew. Because the dispute that started with a demand letter ended with a lesson nobody expected. The HOA believed it could claim ownership of my ranch entrance. They believed the records supported them. They believed the issue was settled long ago. What they didn't realize was that their entire argument rested on an assumption. An assumption repeated for years. An assumption nobody questioned. Until someone finally opened the old files, looked at the original maps, and followed the history all the way back to the beginning. In the end, nobody lost their home. Nobody lost access. Nobody lost the neighborhood. But the HOA lost something else. Certainty. And once certainty disappeared, the truth had room to surface. If you've ever seen a neighborhood dispute where assumptions turned into facts without anyone checking the records, then you already know how quickly small property questions can become major problems. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, consider subscribing and joining us for the next story.